All right, my name is Jean Brown. This is Bill Brown, and we're very excited to hold this event in Hanover at Dartmouth at the Hanover Inn. We think this is a really important evening, and we are glad that you're here to share it with us to see what comes out. Now, before we get started, I want to acknowledge in the audience we have New Hampshire State representatives and senator. And if you would just stand, Mary Hockin Phillips, Sue Prentice, State Senator, Russ Muirhead, Mike Abel. I don't know how tuned in you are to the New Hampshire House, but these people deserve many medals. They've been doing a great job in difficult circumstances. But tonight, we are really honored to have two speakers. We have Linda Fowler, who is a government professor at Dartmouth Emerita. And she is going to give us a context that I think is going to be very important as we move forward and hear what the committee has to say. And she will be followed by Russ Muirhead, who is also a professor of democracy and politics at Dartmouth and is one of our famous New Hampshire reps. Now I'd like to introduce Linda Fowler.
Isn't this great that you've all turned out to hear about an event that is going to be pivotal in American history, one way or the other? And I think we also are so grateful to Jean and Bill for doing this, putting this event together. And for me, as their friends, it's nice to see the Prouty team back in action. So many thanks to you. The January 6th attack on the Capitol was, of course, personally very disturbing to me as a citizen, but it was also disturbing professionally. I'd worked on Capitol Hill. I've studied it for more than 45 years, taught about it, written about it, and I never expected what would happen. I expected the violence, but I never expected that the Capitol would be so poorly prepared to deal with it, and I never expected that only 35% of Republican House members would actually support the legal process of certifying the electorate. That has caused a crisis of confidence, actually, for me. I thought, I've been studying this institution all these years, what did I miss? And so partly what I'm doing tonight is still part of my process of working through what I know about American politics and how that helps me, or not, understand the events that we're seeing now. I want to do two things. First of all, I'd like to do a little context about how this event, January 6th, is very different from the Watergate burglary, and that the investigations that accompanied both of them really happened in very different contexts. And I think that's important because so many commentators have been drawing parallels. And I think to some extent that can be misleading. The other thing I thought I would do would be to talk about what I'm looking for with these hearings as they unfold in terms of evaluating what I think the impact might be. So let's start first with the parallels between Watergate and January 6th. The big ones, I think, are just not similar. Congress as an institution was at record lows of polarization in the late 60s and early 70s. There were lots of moderate Republicans and there were lots of moderate Democrats, and they were from the North and the South, and so it was a very, very different climate in which investigations were taking place then and now. The second thing, of course, is that then there was a sitting president. Now we have a new administration, and so people are inclined to think the system worked. What's everybody getting so agitated for? The third thing has to do with the differences in the media. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, there were three major networks, and everybody watched the same thing, and we all revered Walter Cronkite. The environment couldn't be more different than it is today. In terms of fragmentation and, again, polarization, and even the standards of what constitutes journalism. So those things are all profoundly different and should make us wary of anybody saying, well, this is like Watergate because. But there are two really important similarities. And the first has to do with the importance in the aftermath of the event that both in the 70s and now, we're in the midst of an energy crisis and an inflation crisis. And so people are worried about bread and butter issues. And it was very hard to get their attention then, and it's very hard to get their attention now. The second thing that's similar, I think, is the way in which the timeline of both of these events has evolved. This is a steady drip, 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 incremental accumulation of information. I think most people forget that the Watergate burglary happened in June of 1972. Nixon was reelected with an overwhelming majority. The Watergate burglars were convicted and sentenced in January of 1973. It wasn't until May of 1973 that the Senate Select Committee on the committees of the president's reelection campaign began to go to work. And it was at the instigation of Judge Sirica, who had tried and sentenced the original 5 burglars. So they have these investigations, and so we're already almost a year into when the burglary actually happened. What was critical about those first investigations, not just that a conservative Democrat from North Carolina with a very folksy manner sort of made them accessible to ordinary people, but you had a bombshell dropped in those investigations. John Dean testified publicly that Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell had authorized the burglary, and they were responsible for the cover-up, and the president knew about it. And that, so far, we haven't seen anything quite like that. And although the committee is promising us bombshells this summer, it's not clear yet that there's anything that stands up to the same kind of concrete evidence that the Watergate investigations uncovered. And when the committee reconvened that summer, a man named Butterworth revealed the existence of the White House tapes. And that was really, in my view, the pivotal event, because the special prosecutor who had been appointed in May demanded the tapes. There was a crisis, and Nixon fired him. And the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General quit in response, and it was called the Saturday Night Massacre. What's different now is there aren't the same cracks in the Trump administration. There aren't any whistleblowers yet, and that made a huge difference. And it was really in the fall of 1973, now we're a year and a half into the incident, that the House Judiciary Committee started making plans to conduct impeachment inquiries. But it still is the case that even after that, in May of 1974, Nixon still enjoyed approval ratings in the mid-40s. And there was not serious talk among Republicans about getting rid of the sitting president. Their view was this was apolitical. The witch hunt hadn't been coined as a phrase yet, but a lot of members just felt Nixon did wrong, it shouldn't have happened, but we don't impeach and get rid of a sitting president. And that was the sentiment well into the spring of '74. And eventually, because of the steady drip, drip, drip of prosecutions and indictments and guilty pleas and cooperation with the special prosecutor, that eventually the evidence became so overwhelming that Republican senators went to the president in August of 1974 and said, we don't have the votes in the Senate to protect you from impeachment. If you don't want to be impeached, you'd better resign. And he did. So that's 2 years and 3 months later. So I think when people look at what's happening now and they get very impatient, they want to get the bad guys, right? But it takes a while if you're a country based on laws, and we still are. It takes a while to establish evidence and conduct things properly, and in many ways, I think people who are looking for some sort of instant resolution are going to be disappointed, and I would caution all of you to remember that analogy, that it takes a long time to build consensus over something as major as this. So, what am I looking for? I'm looking for a couple of things. The most important thing is Watergate was an easy story to tell. There was a villain. There was a simple crime of burglary. There were 5 people. We knew who did it. There were enablers in the White House and instigators in the White House. It was simple. When you look at what is involved with January 6th, the attack on the Capitol was just the tip of the iceberg, as we're beginning to find out now. And the tentacles of this event was happening in county Republican parties, in state election secretaries of state offices, among state lawmakers who were organizing to provide alternative electors, among White House officials, among members of Congress. The tentacles of this are everywhere. And the episodes are, there's a lot of conjecture and connecting of dots. It's not a linear narrative the way it was with Watergate. And so the first thing I'm looking for is, can the committee that's investigating January 6th create an intelligible narrative that ordinary people can plug into and say, yes, I'm following the dots and this is where they take me. The second thing I'm looking for is how particular parts of public opinion are going to be influenced. Even at the depths of Nixon's unpopularity, there were still 25% of the public who thought he was a good president and who supported him no matter what. That will probably be the case if Trump is even found to be guilty of instigating this insurrection. And that's just sort of a fact of partisan politics. And I think as citizens, we have to understand that and at least respect the right of people to dissent to what we understand to be the facts. But it is also the case that the way, if you follow the way opinion evolved over Watergate, what begins to happen is the people I'm looking at are donors. Who's giving money to whom? I'm looking at activists. That's why the primaries have been so important, and they've sent a very mixed signal so far in terms of where people stand. I'm looking at toss-up congressional districts and congressional districts that are leaning Republican. Are they attracting strong challengers? Which bodes poorly for Republicans, I think, despite all the talk about off-year elections and the disadvantage the Republicans, that disadvantage that Democrats have. So what I'm looking for is the people who are opinion leaders. They're primarily self-interested people. They're hypersensitive right now to whether this investigation is going to jeopardize their own political goals. Is Trump going to drag them down? Is he going to interfere with their plans to recapture the House or the Senate? And they're watching this very, very closely. And if they see that the hearings are beginning to tell in terms of their district, what they're hearing from their constituency, what the media is starting to write about them, then they create a discourse that becomes very similar to what happened at Watergate. And if that discourse develops, that's when the public starts to pay attention. It's what we call elite discourse in social science, and it's basically based on the idea that most voters don't know what they think about most things. They depend on cues, and this is a well-documented phenomenon. They depend on cues from people who are paying attention. And so the big thing for me is there a credible narrative that people can understand, and does it begin to take hold among political elites, both supporters of the insurrectionists and opponents of what they're doing? So that's what I'm looking for, is what does that story look like, and is it something that gets people talking? In the end, how this turns out is going to be determined, I think, primarily in the courts, as it was with Watergate. And for those of you who are impatient, let's not forget that all the major players spent time in jail. And that's a certain kind of justice. It may not be as satisfying as what some of you would like to see, but it nevertheless sent a very important message. But I would also conclude my talk by saying that even if the investigations succeed in linking Trump to the insurrection and discrediting the MAGA movement, we know from what's happening around the country that there are a large percentage, probably a quarter, maybe a third, of Republicans who have given up on democracy. They're not interested in they think democracy is too inefficient, they don't like it, it makes them vulnerable and feel that they're losing power, so they want something else that will protect their positions of dominance in the society. And that's not going to go away, no matter what these investigations produce. So I would caution you to think this drama in Washington is important, it's historically significant, but really the fate of democracy in this country is going to be playing out in state legislatures, county party committees, poll watchers, and a whole bunch of local folks who see what's happened on the national stage and don't want it happening in their own state and county. So Russ, how about if you take the stage from now?
I'm following Linda tonight. I also followed Linda in the Department of Government at Dartmouth, where she was my senior colleague when I arrived and remains my senior colleague, and an example of really the best that a professor can be. And we just got a little taste of Professor Fowler's, Linda's encyclopedic knowledge. I mean, I can tell you, she's the most effective teacher of American politics I've ever worked with, and students go to her like iron to a magnet. And one of the things that I admire about you, Linda, is that as a professor, Professor Fowler spoke always as a political scientist who was diagnosing the regime itself, the thing of constitutional democracy, not teaching students how to be a liberal Democrat, which perhaps you are, I don't know. Because you never told us. But that's what we need. We need not just, and that's what we're here for tonight. We don't gather as Democrats to remind each other why, as Democrats, we had reason to oppose President Trump. We gather as citizens tonight. And if there's a Republican in the room, if there are many Republicans in the room tonight, you're in the right place at the right time. If there's a Democrat who doesn't really side with if there's an independent who doesn't take a stand with the party so much, you're in the right place. Because tonight's not about just reminding ourselves, if I happen to be a Democrat, it's not just about my fellow Democrats and me reminding ourselves, Richard and I, reminding ourselves, why are we Democrats in the New Hampshire House of Representatives? We need nights for that, but that's not the night we're in tonight. That's not what the moment we're in tonight. And that's not what the January 6th committee is about. This committee, and there are many people in the country, so we need you to go out and talk to your friends about what these hearings are about, what this event is about. And it's not a partisan event. It's not about Democrats just piling on former President Trump. This is about democracy and about what democracy needs. And the key question for tonight is this. Do you think when an office holder loses an election, they should walk away? Walk away from that office peacefully and go home, vacate, and turn it over to the person who won. The most elemental thing. It's the peaceful transfer of power. And it's the most elemental thing in democracy. That losers of elections, when they lose, do not take up violence, but rather walk away. And that winners of elections don't use their newfound power to prosecute those who lost the election, to lock her up, right, to coin a phrase, to humiliate, to harass, to use the powers of government, the power of politics, to oppress their opponents and incapacitate their opponents from organizing and contesting in a future election. That's really what democracy depends on. And it's a practice. It involves some ideas and some commitments and some norms, but it's really a practice. And we're here tonight to stand up for that proposition that democracy depends on this practice. That we need officials, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or whatever, when they lose elections, to walk away. We need winners of elections not to be tempted to use their power to oppress their opponents and incapacitate their opponents. It's that simple. And that's why we gather as citizens, not as partisans. And I really do think, as a partisan and as a professor of politics, that Professor Fowler's example, for me in particular, is really extraordinarily instructive, because I have to balance those two things in my own professional lives. And so I really do appreciate that reminder and that example, because there aren't great examples of that in the world today. The first time that this happened, that an office holder lost an election, and I mean really lost an election not just to another human being, but to another, almost to another government, to another philosophy of government, to another platform and program and purpose, was in the election of 1800 in the United States of America, when John Adams of Quincy lost the election, a very highly contested, fraught election, one might even say rigged election, a really closely contested election, to that man, Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams did not feel good about it. He did not attend the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. He was bitter, he was angry, he was humiliated. He got on his horse and galloped back to Quincy and walked away. He walked away. And that was the first time in human history that you see a government turn over peacefully. Not the first time one person turns over power to another person. That would probably be, well, there might be lots of examples of that happening, but in our politics, it'd be George Washington, who just 4 years earlier, after 2 terms, turned over power to John Adams. And the reason we don't cite that one as a particularly, actually that's also pretty huge. That George Washington could have been a king and he could have been president until he died, and he could have been president effectively forever. He also turned over power. Not as big a thing as John Adams, because John Adams and George Washington were from the same, they had the same philosophy of government. They had the same idea of what government was for and what it should be doing. They're both called Federalists. And we would say party. They're from the same party, although they weren't, certainly George Washington wasn't calling himself a partisan. But you can almost substitute party for government. It's a whole orientation of the government. So it's like a government, not a party. And so the first big turnover of party was 1800, but the first turnover of power was 1796, when Washington gives power to Adams and sets this kind of informal 2-term limit, which later gets codified after FDR as a formal constitutional limit on the presidency. And last year, April 2021, Putin changes the constitution in Russia. He's reached the end of his term limit. He does not want to turn over power. He's going to run, his term ends in 2024. He changed the constitution so he can continue presiding over Russia until 2036. President for life. I'm going to kind of make up the year here. That was 2020. 2018, I actually remember, 2018. Xi Jinping in China does the same thing, getting to the end of his term. Changes the constitution in China. We wouldn't call these democracies, but they emulate democracies. Our presidents aren't going to be rulers for life. Xi Jinping doesn't like it. He makes a change and he makes himself president for life. So this is what we see in China. This is what we see in Russia, and we would say, we would have said, it can't happen here. And what we're gathered tonight to bear witness to is that it almost did happen here, and that it might very well happen here. And if every time someone who loses an election says the election was rigged, Democrats could start saying that too. Sure. When they lose elections. If every time an incumbent office holder who loses an election says, I'm not going to concede, I'm going to call my supporters to take up violence, this system will end. It will end in the next decade, as it did in so many, as it has. So many other democracies around the world have moved toward authoritarianism, so will democracy in America. We're here tonight as citizens to bear witness to a possible assault on this elemental democratic norm. Not to gather as liberals or as Democrats and say, we have 50 reasons to oppose Trump and Trumpism and whatever. I can talk about why I oppose conservatism or republicanism if you want to, but that's not what we're here for tonight. We're here as citizens of a constitutional democracy who want to uphold it. I hope there are Republicans in the room. I hope that you're friends with Republicans and that you can talk to them about why this isn't a partisan event. That's what we need to do. We need to describe this to our friends and family and frame it for people. Frame what this is really about. It's about walking away when you lose an election, the most elemental thing. And it's also about forsaking violence. In the 1930s in Germany, violence just came to the streets. It was a common occurrence. And I'm really terrified that we could slide into that same decay of the rule of law. And just this week, there was perhaps somebody from my side of politics, who almost took the life of a Supreme Court justice, who plotted and planned to shoot a Supreme Court justice. And if that's where our politics goes, democracy is over. Here's why why standing up for democracy, what we're doing tonight, actually isn't easy. You think standing up for this elemental norm, we're talking about is like pre-8th grade democratic norms. If you lose an election, leave the office. But it actually takes enormous self-discipline, an enormous commitment to constitutional democracy itself for this to happen, because we really disagree with each other. We disagree with each other more intensely, more urgently, and about more consequentially than at any time in my lifetime. And I don't have to walk through the kinds of issues we're dealing with in the State House, or the kinds of issues that our federal legislators are dealing with. But really the shape of our community depends on which party's in power right now. And just look at the abortion restriction that was passed in the last 2 years in the state of New Hampshire. And so because we disagree, it's hard to tolerate each other. It's hard to turn over power. And that's exactly why we have to stand up for this norm more courageously, more steadfastly than at any time in our lives.
Amen.
Thank you.